Response to Luddite Returns, who has returned to the subject of antinatalism once again. And back to Benatar, the asymmetry. An overview. Okay. He left a comment on one of my videos about the Nietzsche stuff. So he's another defender of Nietzsche, which is this, in my opinion, just defending poetry rather than logic. I mean, Nietzsche critiqued. It's like he took the animals as they came out of Noah's Ark and just started complaining about which ones, the flaws in all of them, in everything, as if there's purpose in that. And yeah, fine, but there's no point in not acknowledging something like structure or some other part of its form that is of value. You could say there's, by some standard, you'd have to have, but that's it, you'd have to have a standard, you'd have to have a logical standard where you're judging cars based, let's say they're cars coming off the assembly line, and yeah, you could complain about the color or the style or even the aerodynamics, but that might be a good standard, though. The efficiency, fuel efficiency, or you're going to measure it by how powerful it is, how fast it goes, or what is the thing? And there's no thing in Nietzsche. There's no goal. The goal is merely to say this car will pass these other cars, or I don't even know if that's the the end, because he doesn't define a goal. He establishes no goal, and there's just this statement that let each car just be the best at being car. It's not even that. But I'm just saying that there has to be a logic by which you judge. And that's what Benatar is just pointing out, a mathematical problem. You're not going to be able to apply poetry to it. There's no poetry here. There's none of your gooey emotional crapola about the fact that there is some redemption in just because you want there to be. You have to demonstrate it somewhere in this clinical view of it. I mean, we're back to some kind of word like anthropomorphizing, where the very fact that we can do that from this human standard, the fact that we are applying something as if it is something because we have it, because we are capable of saying there's innate purpose because we feel innate purpose. Feeling it and proving it are two different things, and that's where you're always going to fail on this argument of the asymmetry, because it is quite clear that the universe could be bestowed with Nietzsche's Obermann. There could be you could say, let us all be Schwarzenegger-esque. Let's all build ourselves psychologically into the best machine for feeding. I could always build something twice as good, at least a foot taller, or whatever, 100 pounds stronger, or some other crap. I can always modify that into something else that's always going to be incrementally more of that thing. And so there's no accomplishment in it. It doesn't go anywhere. The very core of your function is to create an artificial goal and to chase it. That's the function. And you're not going to be able to argue a real goal, because there isn't one. It's just in your perception. You create the problem, then you say, here's the solution to the problem I created. And the problem, the real solution to the problem you created, is not to bother with your creation. Anyway, let's play along.
Harm. Now, defining harm is not at all uncontroversial. Indeed, literally hundreds of essays and counter...
I figured that was going to happen. Yeah, I started his video yesterday. I just haven't gotten around to it. So I haven't listened to this. It was I just avoided the initial,
David Benatar,
you know, paraphrases of Benatar.
in short.
I've already been there.
Pleasure is good, pain is bad. Absent pleasure, absent an exister is not bad. While absent pain, absent an exister is good. Benatar concludes, in light of said asymmetry, that coming into existence is always a harm. Now, defining harm is not at all uncontroversial. Indeed, literally hundreds of essays and counter-essays have been written on this word alone.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, the key point to it is, though, is you have to go mechanically one step back. All right. You have to. It's like viewing the microbe. You know, it looks like it's doing something because, you know, we are familiar with doing, and we say that's what we see first, and we don't really recognize that. Okay, it's a chain of reactions. It's just a mechanism of chemical reactions, and that's all there is. There is nothing else happening. It looks like it needs a little smiley face or frowny face painted on it because that's what it looks like, but what it looks like is not what it is. And so when you look at this idea of what it is that we derive out of life, this thing called gratification or satisfaction is not the opposite is not the harm. There is in fact no benefit to be gained by, again, cleaning up a mess you make. So by having a need, okay, it is completely an artificial perception that you are accomplishing something by fixing it. It's like building a broken building and then repairing the building and saying, now I have value because I repaired what was broken. But it didn't need to be broken in the first place. And that lack of need for the existence of the broken makes all of anything you call a positive derived out of it meaningless. You can't make it a positive to correct against something you created as a negative first. That can't be used to balance against what are just gratuitous negatives that aren't compensated for. The mortal death, the condition that will kill you, the suffering that will be incurred in that death. There will be no redemption for that payment. There won't be. It will only be in your psychology if it's anywhere. It won't be in the practical fact of your life. There'll be nothing that you do in your life beyond what you do for others, fixing some other brokenness created by some other person, preventing some harm that was not created by your existence, that you'll be able to compensate for anything. You can only create a surplus in your existence by going out into the world and cleaning up another mess, somebody else's mess. But that's all. That's when we derive a thing called a surplus, a true positive. Because creating your own mess and then saying I resolved it satisfactorily is not in and of itself an accomplishment. And if it was, we would lament all the non-existence in the universe. We would lament the void of the moon and the void of the Mars and the void of Pluto. Every surface in the universe we would somehow notice. We would somehow be diminished by our imagination of all the great positive that could be created there. And we don't do that. And we don't do that because it isn't real. It's only real for us personally. It's not real in the world.
Involving hedonistic and non-hedonistic frameworks, non-hedonic goods, intransivity, modal logic, etc. Defining harm, such as to license intrinsic evaluative and or normative impetus embedded in the supposed validity and exclusivity within the boundaries of the definition, is in fact notoriously controversial.
Well, whatever. It's, all of this bibble babble to say, look, sorry, I don't think it's that complicated. Cut through all this millennia of rhetoric. The end product, the game we know internally, is the fact that I certainly know the difference between in a comfortable and uncomfortable. And I would say it's very easy for me, anyway, to drop uncomfortable, plagued, blighted, miseried, in pain, all kinds of different kinds of pains, all kinds of blights, all kinds of stuff goes on inside of this sensitive organism. The leaf blower next door, an irritation, an annoyance, a vibration that's repugnant. All right, yes, it's not crippling, okay, but it exists as a negative. Yeah, I can easily put them all in a bucket and let go, called harm. All of those are the negatives. Harm, negative, bad. The adjectives aren't difficult. The synonyms, they aren't hard to find. It's very easy to drop things into the bucket called harm. It's not complicated. In and of themselves, moments of experience can be dropped in the bucket. They don't need to be put into a context. They don't need to be defended by saying, well, I jump into the fire and save 10 people from burning. Well, yes, obviously now my harm has become a good, but the fact that I'm experiencing a harm still remains. The thing I'm experiencing still falls in the harm bucket. Yes, the context is that event has a string tied to it that says okay, but that okay, but doesn't change the fact that I'm experiencing something we can call harm.
But assuming the hedonistic framework intrinsic to the asymmetry, harm being identified with suffering.
Well, again, this hedonistic, again, they keep using the word because they like to use the word because it has applied to it gluttony. All right, and there's nothing about risk aversion, risk negation, or even calculations of utilitarianism in the word hedonism. So it has absolutely no relevance to this conversation. It's just a slur. It's just a grotesque attempt to slur the philosophy with some sort of notion of reckless pursuit of desire when it is exactly the opposite. It is cautious respect for danger. And so I mean, this in itself, what is a cheat. Why play with that word?
And in benefit with pleasure, harm can roughly be expounded on as follows, in short. One is harmed if the experiential state one enters into is worse than the previous experiential state.
Oh, well, that is just, that doesn't say anything about a real harm, right? I mean, I suppose. All right, let me make sure. Is it possible to be in a state? Okay, any degrade of a state. So you could argue that anything less than perfect would be a harm. Okay, I'll accept it then.
One is benefited if the experiential state one enters into is better than the previous experiential state.
Now, benefited is a tricky word. So again, you have to be careful about what word you use again to establish what is a real positive. So your state, okay, you can't call it a benefit because you go from the 10th floor in the dungeon to the 8th floor in the dungeon and say, okay, now I have done something that is truly positive. No, you've erased part of the negative. You cleaned up part of the spilt milk. So now there's only 7 square miles of oil slick. You reduce it to 6 square miles. You've obviously accomplished something that's good, but there's still 6 square miles of oil slick, so the overall condition can't be called benefited. I mean, if benefited is going to mean something more than elevated from a lesser state.
It's here to speak of lowercase and uppercase harm and benefit, as one may be benefited, though one state, all things considered, be that of harm, and one may be harmed, though one state, all things considered, be that of benefit.
Well, see, that's where you broke it again. So you start off correct, and then you broke it by saying, that you can gain benefit by being in harm. And that can only happen by you, again, creating a fix of some other problem you didn't create. You can't say you're productive in your spilling of the milk because you cleaned up half the milk. You just can't do that. That's not saying you're now productive. Productive would have been not to spill the milk.
So regarding failing to come into existence and its evaluation, one can safely say the following. Non-existence involves the absence of suffering and the absence of those things that persons would counterfactually deem as life affirmation worthy, in our case, pleasure.
Right. Well, the experience of pleasure is, again, just a byproduct of the absence of an encumbrance. So you could quite, I think, logically argue that pleasure is what you will have if you extract burden. If you extract the tensions, the irritants, the deprivations, all of that negative, then you'll automatically have your positive. But it is not a positive built out of something original. It is not a real gift. The gift is essentially giving a cure. It's not creating some new thing, some better thing. It's fixing what's broken.
But as said, counterfactual benefits are not experienced by the non-exister as bad. Of course, existence being the condition of possibility of experience, we can say confidently that not coming into existence is never a harm. Of course, one immediately sees that even if...
there's no potential for a negative, which is... that is the automatic neutral, and again, I'm going to argue that any other perception you have of a benefit, anything that you're saying is a necessary benefit, let's call it a necessary benefit. There's no such thing as a necessary benefit without the existence of you to say so. Without you, it doesn't exist in and of itself in the world. There is no necessity, urgency, demand, logical imperative that there be wanters, needers, hopers on Mars. There's nothing. There's no statement being made anywhere rationally discernible, logically hearable, screaming, saying, there is a necessity to create this positive. This positive makes something negative. Its absence is discernible. It's not a discernible absence. You can't see the empty chair. It's not there. There's nothing saying there's no nest in need of an egg.
If not coming into being is an abstract good, and I say abstract because no one experiences said good, that is, the absence of suffering, does not follow that coming into being always constitutes a harm.
Well, like I said, it just depends on whether you're going to negate self-perception, self-declaration. Okay? The argument is that beyond whether or not you experience moments of bliss or think you have skillfully played the game or have been productive, thinking you are productive does not make you productive. thinking you're a good husband does not make you a good husband. I mean, these are all the rules of reality. All right? So you thinking you're winning does not mean you're winning. And what I think Benatar is saying, what I'm saying, is if you really analyze what the race is, okay, you're not even moving. You have no hope of moving. You have no hope of running a race. Because there is no real goal. There is no positive you can ever get to. There's nothing you can construct that could possibly be needed, okay, until you show up and say, I need it. There is no physical need. There is no logical need. There is no need in the material universe until you, as a sentient, show up and say, I need.
It is a contingent feature of the actual world that coming into existence will involve harms lowercase. But in light of the benefits as had in existence, not had in non-existence, it does not follow that coming into existence is always a net harm.
Well, again, it can't be anything other than a net harm. It just can't. Like, again, you cannot construct some other mechanism that would not to make it a net harm. Because you can't tell me what this gift is, what this thing is that needs to exist, but yet we cannot detect it logically. It only needs to exist in your psychology. The claim of victory only exists in your psychology. There is no evidence of the victory. There's no evidence of the goal scored. There's no evidence that the goal needed to be scored. There's nothing except you saying it's important. I needed to do it. It needed to get done. Well, that's not good enough. So again, your life can never be anything other than a net harm unless you do something to clean up the mess the other sentients are making. Unless you clean up somebody else's harm mess, there's no way you can come out of this a winner.
Now, if the absence of suffering is good, even though no one ever benefits from it, in our case, for the non-existent person, who would otherwise...
It really doesn't matter. Again, you keep talking as if there needs to be a beneficiary, and when all we really have to say is it produces it. Okay, so I mean, if I said if I kill a syphilis microbe, I kill it, and therefore it cannot reproduce itself, and it therefore does not make copies, and so now I have reduced the number of syphilis microbes by 1 billion because I killed that one. Okay, I mean, clearly the benefit, okay, is realized in the sense that you recognize that now there'll be less of this negative thing in the world. There'll be no producer of it. So just recognize the fact that it contains the negative taint when it exists. It creates it. It pushes it into an ether, let's say. Let us say that our economy in our life was being calculated based on a piece of something that drifted off of us and was kept on a tape somewhere or recorded in a computer or someplace. This little notch of a negative or a positive was recorded. It has to be, in a sense, recorded for you to say there's no record. Well, of course, you have to record it for there to be a record of it. But the record is there if you record the event. If you acknowledge the event, record it, then you can do these calculations. And you can understand that if it doesn't exist, if you prevent something negative, something that would produce a negative on the record, you can surely understand how that absence of a bit on that tape in that negative column will mean that the net conclusion in math will come out differently. It's not about the beneficiary. It's not about the experiencer. It's about the equation and the net product. So again, you can't apply some poetry of the individual to a calculation of the function. Just as if I didn't do some horrid lab experiment where I take 100 rats and torture them, and instead I say, no, I won't bother doing that. Clearly those rats benefited from not being horribly tortured, in the sense that they would have been. You can't negate the fact that that has value. I mean, not rationally negated. You can use this sophistry, this wordplay, to attempt to negate it, but you can't logically negate the benefit.
Exist. The presence of pleasure for the exister can be better than the absence of pleasure, even though no one was deprived of said pleasure by not having come into existence.
Well, again, it's not about being deprived of pleasure. It's about the syntheticness of the nature of pleasure. Okay, that you can't extract the pleasure from what is required to create it. Okay, so unlike the misery, okay, that is in and of itself, the pleasure only has value in the context of the mechanism that creates it, and the truth of the fact that you only gain this pleasure by elevating yourself out of this dungeon, this blight. So you must be put in the blight first. You must be put in the imperfect condition before you can strive for some less imperfect condition and achieve this thing called satisfaction or pleasure. And that is the nature of the difference between calculating one and calculating the other. One doesn't need the context of the machinery. The other one does need the context. One is the original cause, the negative, and the other is the reflexive opposite reaction effect. So pleasure is an effect, harm is a cause.
In his essay, Benatar and the Logic of Betterness, Ben Bradley penned a simple, clarifying proposition. If pleasure is intrinsically good, and the absence of...
Well, again, see, intrinsically good is the error, okay? You can't extract pleasure. You can't want without the deprivation. You can't need or gain pleasure or gain gratification without knowledge of failure. It's like you can't see victory unless you have knowledge of failure. You have to be made hungry for it. There's no other way for the food to have gratifying potential without the presence of a hunger.
Pleasure is not. Then pleasure must be intrinsically better than the absence of pleasure.
Well, again, so that is your thesis. Again, you're going to keep contending that there is some pleasure void on Mars right now, that there's this grievous pleasure void, and that if I was to put suffering creatures on Mars, and let's say, and we were just to measure the absence of a pleasure void on Venus, so here we had two circumstances. We are going to, as hard as we can, conceive and feel and realize the pleasure void on Venus, and I will create harm and suffering and misery on Mars. And now you're going to say, when we look at these two planets, which one do we go to first to rescue? The void, the horrible absence of the magnificent pluses, the pluses that were being denied, the huge benefit of the happy Venetian? Or do I rescue the suffering Martian? I don't think by any imagination you can contrive that you can't figure out which one is more important. Just as I could argue that if there is a fire in one house and there is, let's say, a woman having sex with a man with too small a penis, which should gain my attention? The potentially burning woman, or the woman who, oh yeah, we could just pop a little extra inch or two on there and fix that for her? So the one being denied the better pleasure, or the one being exposed to the greater harm? I think, again, it's too obvious which one has the megaton more mass of meaning and substance, and which one has almost no meaning and almost no substance, and which we could fully understand is so weak and so light that maybe all weight that it has is a contrivance of our psychology, our wish that it was so, our hope that it would mean something. but it doesn't mean anything in any kind of reality.
The logic of preferability stipulates as much. The asymmetry itself in identifying pleasure as good similarly stipulates as much. As with the word harm.
Yeah, well, it's only a good once you create the mechanism that needs the good. So again, understand the word good in its context. It's only good because the thing you created needs it. Just as gasoline only has value if you have engines that can burn it. You must have a thing. The diamond has no value unless there's a human to sit there and contrive its value, correct? So I'm saying, so what Benatar is clearly just saying, that yes, there's good in taking the sentient creature once it exists and elevating its condition as high as you can. There is certain good in removing its elevated condition, to take it as close to that perfection as possible, to take it as far away from harm as possible. There is certain good in doing that. But again, that good has no meaning until you create the hunger first. Again, the food has no real value until you create something that needs it. And the argument is a simple argument that if you don't, there's no need to create the need. That's where the fundamental truth lies. There is no need to create need. I mean, that statement in and of itself is the statement. It's the one that answers the question. It tells you why you don't mess with this. There's no need. Logical, rational, no contrivance of purpose or function in creating the need, the mess maker. Then you don't have to clean anything up. You don't have to elevate it if you don't sink it. Again, there's only good in rising the thing from the quicksand. There is no above the quicksand. There's no place above the quicksand. There's just deeper in the quicksand and less deep in the quicksand, but there's no above the quicksand.
Definitions of the word good are far from uncontroversial, but contemporary meta-ethicists tend to define goodness in terms of betterness, from which one can derive the theorem: if P is good and Q is not good, then P is better than Q. So that if pleasure is good, as identified by the asymmetry, then the absence of pleasure is not good. Again,
you just can't play this kind of game, because again, there's pleasure like eating popcorn. You can't qualify that as a good of standard value to compensate for chemotherapy. You have to understand the value weight. So we're back to the Venus and Mars scenario, where you're going to be hard-pressed to say, let's load up the fire trucks and head off to the non-pleasure planet to put pleasure on it, instead of going to the abundant suffering planet and negating the suffering. You're not going to be able to make a logical argument defending taking the resources and zooming off to Venus to fix its problem, because it doesn't have a problem. It's not in deficit because it's not making positives. It's just not possible to be in deficit for not making positives, because there aren't any real positives. It's the simple truth. There's only extraction from negative.
Identified by the asymmetry, then pleasure is better than the absence of pleasure. So on my own accord, I came to the conclusion that I've noted several meta-ethicists have come to, Elizabeth Harman and Ben Bradley among them, as regards the asymmetry, and to quote the latter, it is as follows. His argument at most establishes that failing to come to exist is a net good. But that does not entail that coming to exist is a net harm. Even if a prospective person suffers a net good by not coming to exist, this doesn't exclude the possibility that their coming to exist is also a net good.
Okay, this doesn't exclude the possibility. Well, I think the possibility is excluded, okay, if you recognize that the only way you're going to be a net good is you have to clean up another mess that some other sentient is creating. You have to prevent some other harm from just your own harm. So again, this mess making, there's other people making messes. You can clean up your mess. You can clean up the mess they make. There's your welfare. There's the welfare of all the other sentients. Obviously, it doesn't make much difference in terms of value whether you extract somebody else from harm or you extract yourself from harm. If I prevent a broken leg and it's my own or it's yours, there isn't much difference in any kind of rational sense between those two events. Okay, they're both positive events. They're both extractions from this harm. So yes, I can be productive, I can be valuable in my existence if I do good in the world. But just doing good for myself, all I can do at best is maintain myself as close to perfection as possible at all times, so I incur no deficit for which I can't compensate with any real positive. So I'm just saying the internal math is impossible, okay, if you're an island. If you're in and of yourself, there's no way, okay, you can ever create a surplus, because you must have the negative first to convert it into a positive. There's no true positive. There is no atmosphere above the quicksand. There is no place to go that is truly free of this necessity born of deprivation, of contrived, artificial, imposed negative that needs elevating. The force is decidedly negative, and the only positive is extracted through taking away the thing that has blighted, the thing that has tarnished, the thing that has degraded the state.
So while Benatar's asymmetry clearly fails to establish that coming into existence is always a net harm, it seems quite evident that people are harmed, assuming a hedonistic framework or otherwise, by coming into being. So, that is, procreation will involve the risk of net harm. And it is to the topic of risk that we shall turn in a future video. I think in the next video I will discuss why it is that I'm at odds, I suppose, with the kind of hedonistic framework often assumed by contemporary antinatalists.
Again,
anyway, thank you for listening.
I see just no purpose. Again, hedonism, you can do the Google search on the word hedonism, and you will find nothing about risk aversion. You'll find nothing about calculating or anything of utilitarian, of balance and net product, and you'll see everything about merely chasing ambition, chasing desire, chasing greed, gluttony. These things are hedonism. Hedonism is just walking towards these mechanics of our nature. So again, this is just a horribly abuse of language to apply hedonism to anything that would be implying balance. It's a word that can't be resurrected to apply to value equations that have any balance in them whatsoever. It's an unbalanced word, and it has no place in this conversation. It's an abuse of language to use it. It's pulling the Hitler card or something. It's just fucking bullshit. It's a cheap shot. It's irritating that every time you speak it, I'm going to have to re-qualify and explain that this philosophy of antinatalism has clearly nothing to do with hedonism. It has to do with recognizing that there are games too costly to play, that there are mechanisms too dangerous to be built.